Hi and welcome back to my channel and what will be a monthly wrap-up of all the books that I read in March. When I say it like that, it sounds like I read so many books, but in the end it was only 4 books. I traveled in March and I was very busy at work, so I'm still pretty happy with 4 books in total. So the first book I finished was The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. And I think most of you watching are familiar with this book because it's been such a hyped up book on BookTube. And I think that's the reason why I had very high expectations, maybe even unfairly high expectations. So when I ended up not liking the book, it was an even bigger disappointment than it would have been otherwise, I think. And thankfully it's a very easy book to read. It's very fast paced, so even though I didn't like the book, it was very easy for me to finish, so that's a positive at least. My main issue with the book is that it's very flat. I don't want to give away any spoilers, so I will keep my comments very surface level and not really get into the specifics, but I found the story and the characters to be pretty flat. So for those of you who don't know, this book is about Evelyn Hugo, who is an old, very famous Hollywood movie star, and she contacts a journalist to write her memoir, and we are given the story as Evelyn is telling it to the journalist who is writing the book. And as the title of the book gives away, Evelyn has been married 7 times, and the narrative in the story is sort of based on each husband. The book and the story is about much more than just her marriages, but each section of the book is more or less based on or revolves around one husband. And when I started reading this book, I really felt that it had potential. And in the beginning, a very interesting question is asked, but it's being answered pretty much right away. And after that, I really sort of lost interest and my curiosity went away and it never really came back. So after that, I was just reading without really caring about what happened or how the characters were feeling, which is not a great thing when you're reading. And I really felt that there was so much potential for the characters. They could have been so interesting, but since we are given her whole life in a short book, I think it's 350 pages, everything is so surface level that we never have time to really get to know any of the characters. So I feel like if more time had been spent on fewer characters, I think the book could have been really good actually, but so it's a missed opportunity. And to summarize, I'm giving this book 2 stars, and the reason I'm not giving it 1 star is because it was easy to read, very fast paced, so I wasn't hopelessly bored. I just didn't care in the end. So the second book I finished in March was Island of Secrets by Rachel Ries. And this was another disappointment for me. The reason I picked up this book is because it's set in Cuba, and that's something that I'm really drawn to for some reason. I'm not really sure why, but when I read, I felt like the author had never been to Cuba, even though I know that she has, but I've never been to Cuba, and I felt like I could have described the environments with more details than she did. I had really hoped to be immersed in Cuba, Cuban culture and Cuban people, but no, that didn't happen. So that was a big disappointment. So in short, the story is set in the 1950s and the main character is Iris, a young English woman who works as a typist, but really dreams of being an artist. And she gets invited to a big, expensive American Hollywood wedding in Cuba to draw the guests. But she very soon discovers that things are not as idyllic as she thought, and that there are a lot of secrets within the families involved in the wedding. So like I said before, I was very disappointed that Cuba wasn't featured more. I felt like the story could have taken place anywhere, and Cuba and Cubans were not important to the story at all, and I really feel like it was a missed opportunity. I also didn't like the characters very much. I felt like I never really got to know them, and they were pretty stereotypical. The only character we got to know is the main character Iris, because the book is written from her perspective. But she in turn is not very interesting. She's kind of boring and quite passive, so in the end I didn't really care what happened to her. And there's also a romance in the book, and that makes absolutely no sense, so I didn't care about that either. So to summarize, I'm giving this book 1 to 1.5 stars, because I haven't thought once about this book after I finished it, and I think that tells you all you need to know about the impression this book made on me. So the third book I finished in March was Call for the Dead by John le Carré, and he is known for writing about espionage, and he started writing in the 60s, so he wrote a lot about the Cold War, something I'm very interested in myself, so I wanted to try out his books. And he himself worked for the British Secret Service, so he had a lot of insight into this world. And despite the name, he's not French, he is English, and John le Carré is just his nom de plume. And I think many of you might have seen adaptations of his books, because there are many. And you might have seen the movie Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, which is based on one of his books. And there's also a TV series called The Night Manager, which is on Amazon Prime in France. So many of you have maybe seen that as well. If you haven't, I recommend both the movie and the TV series. They are both great. So since I had never read any of John le Carré's books, I wanted to start from the beginning to get to know the characters properly. And in this book we are introduced to one of his most famous characters, who is recurring in many of his books, and that is George Smiley. And he works for the British Secret Service. And the story in this book is about East German spies sort of working and operating in the UK. So I give this book 3 stars. I did enjoy reading it, but the writing style of the author is not what I'm used to, and I was not really prepared for that. His text is kind of unstructured, and for someone whose knowledge about espionage and that whole world comes from James Bond movies, it was kind of hard to keep up at times. And I think a contributing factor is that the book was written in 1961, so it is referencing things that are obsolete now and doesn't even exist. But towards the end of the book, there's sort of a recap of everything that happened in the book, and it made it really easy to understand what had happened and why. So I did finish the book on a high note, and I would love to read more books by him. And next time I think I will try out one of his books that are more well known and like highly regarded. So yeah, there are going to be more John le Carré in my future videos. So the fourth and last book I finished in March is the third part of 1Q84 by Haruki Murakami, and I really enjoyed reading this story. I started the first part in January this year, so I've been living with this story for the whole of 2022 until now, and I enjoyed reading part 1 and 2 a little bit more than the third part, and the reason is because a lot of what had already been said and done in part 1 and 2 were repeated in part 3. So I think that part 3 could have done with being a bit shorter, but I really think that they should be judged as one book, and I really enjoyed reading this story. So this is my first time reading magical realism, and I'm so glad I gave it a try. I was really skeptical before I did it, but now I really want to read more in this genre. And this book is about two young Japanese people, one young man and one young woman. And the man is working as a math teacher, and on the side he's an aspiring writer, and he gets convinced by his publisher to rewrite a manuscript written by a 17-year-old girl, but they are all going to pretend that it's the girl who wrote the whole book by herself. And the other main character, the young woman, she works as a fitness instructor, and on the side she's doing some illegal stuff. And they live in our normal world in Tokyo in 1984, but then some small strange things start to happen, and we are brought into a new world that is slightly different to our own. And that's sort of where the adventure starts, and it involves a religious cult. I don't want to give any spoilers, so I'm going to stop there and not go into more specific details about the story. Before I read this book, I heard a lot of people saying that this is not a good choice for someone who's never read magical realism before, or someone who hasn't read Haruki Murakami before. But I have to say that I completely disagree. I found it very easy to follow along, and I really enjoy his writing style. It's very to the point, and he has a very good rhythm and flow in his writing, which makes it very fun and easy to read. But no book is perfect, and there are things in this book that I think are a bit, I don't know, too icky and too weird. And when he's writing from the perspective of the main female characters, her actions are perhaps not in line with how I would perceive women to behave most of the time. But it's fiction, and they are his characters, and he's free to do whatever he wants with his characters. So I'm not really too bothered by that, but I was eye-rolling a few times. So to summarize, I'm giving this book 4 stars. I really enjoyed reading something from a new genre. And what I also enjoyed is that I felt like the story could go anywhere. I had no way to tell where the story was going or what to expect, and I think that's something great. I also really enjoyed the characters. They were people, they were not stereotypes, and I really felt like I got to know them, and there was such a big change and contrast to the other books I read this month, so that was a big positive. So that was the last book in this monthly wrap-up, and I just want to say thank you for watching, and see you next time.